Yeah, isn't that a kind of terrible view of men? Isn't it a really sort of sad and negative view of men, where men are seen as kind of uncontrollable, sex-driven pigs who can't control their sexual desires and are perfectly happy to, abuse and rape someone just for sexual relief? It is a very terrible view of men, and it's a simply inaccurate one.
In this episode, I speak to Professor Michael Flood, a researcher, author, and advocate on masculinities, violence prevention, and gender equality. This discussion contains topics of a sexual nature and may be disturbing or triggering to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. This is the #NoExcuse Podcast, discussing the challenges and complexities and potential solutions in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the aid sector, through interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I am Guni Dias, your host and global focal point for the department. Michael, thank you for joining us on the #NoExcuse Podcast.
My pleasure.
So let's begin with you. You spent decades studying masculinities, violence prevention, and gender equality. What really drew you into this work?
Look, it's hard to say. It's a question I've been asked a lot, and I've got a tentative answer. My tentative answer is that it certainly began with some kind of interest I had as a teenager in wanting to be a good person and change the world. So some kind of activist and ethical orientation. I also had some sense of distance from traditional masculinity in some ways. But when I went to university, I got involved in left-wing student politics, and feminist women were the backbone of the group in which I was involved. So I was being challenged on my sexism. We were talking about issues of gender and sexism, gender inequality. For some reason, and I don't really know why, I did what was at the time called women's studies, or is now called gender studies. So I was being exposed to feminist scholarship. Then, I think when I was about 20 or 21, I joined a men's group. I stumbled across a notice for the formation of men's groups in Canberra, where I lived. And I ended up joining this anti-sexist men's group. And we met for 3.5 hours every second Tuesday for about 2 years. And we talked about violence and pornography and sexism and fathering and body image and bullying and so on. And so a series of involvements when I was quite young, in my late teens and early 20s, for me really cemented a passion for issues of gender and sexual politics. And I then I became a community educator, working in schools, working with professionals. I eventually decided to do a PhD and took far too long to do the PhD, but eventually I got it done. And I kind of gravitated towards academia. And so I've stayed in academia now for over 30 years, most of 30 years, researching on men, masculinities and gender, but also still involved in education out in the community and giving public commentary, and involved also in advocacy. And none of that's to say I know everything or I've got it all right. I still make mistakes. I still get it wrong in my own life personally and in my work. But it certainly feels like a privilege now to have work that fulfills a passion.
So help me address this. Why are we talking about men, and what do we mean by masculinities? Because I suspect that some of the men who may be listening might be feeling that we are pointing fingers at them. So let's clarify, why are we making this connection between men and understanding the prevention of sexual misconduct?
Sure. Look, the first thing it's important to say is that in most contexts, most men don't perpetrate sexual misconduct. Most men don't sexually harass, don't use sexual violence, don't use domestic violence. I say in most contexts because there's some studies finding that in fact it is a majority of men in some countries or contexts. But in most, that's not the case. It's a minority of men. A large minority, not 1 or 2%, but sometimes 20% or 30%, but it's a minority of men. And we know that masculinity shapes that behaviour. Now, to define masculinity, masculinity refers to the behaviours and attributes that are expected of men. It refers to the social expectations placed on men. And in many contexts, many men learn that to be a man is to be tough, to be strong, to be in control, to be dominant over women, to be sexually aggressive. And the men who've learnt that and the men who take up those expectations themselves are more likely to perpetrate sexual misconduct than other men. As I've said, most men don't behave in those ways, but the men who do tend to be men who agree most strongly with a model of traditional sexist masculinity. And, many men will say, that's terrible that sexual misconduct occurs, but what's it got to do with me? And I very much want to argue that sexual misconduct and domestic and sexual violence more broadly are men's issues. They're men's issues in part because they hurt the women and girls in our lives. Most men have women and girls in our lives and care for those women and girls. And the harm and abuse that some men perpetrate harms the women and girls we care about. Second, that violence, that abuse that some men perpetrate makes all of us a threat. For example, if I get off the bus or get off the train at night and I'm walking behind a woman who's walking home, she may be thinking, is he following me? Is he planning to assault me? And it doesn't matter how nice a guy, how good a guy I am, the fact that some men do behave in that way makes me and other men seem a threat. And men have a key role to play in speaking up about that violence, that abuse, and trying to build a culture in which that form of behaviour becomes unacceptable.
Do we have data on this in terms of percentage?
Look, there's certainly been studies in a range of countries, for example, about the proportions of men who've ever perpetrated sexual violence. A large-scale systematic review in the US and Canada, for example, found that 29% of male university students, so just under one-third, 29%, had perpetrated sexual violence at some point in their lives. And about 6% had perpetrated rape, that is, forced penetration. Studies in other countries find similar percentages or even higher percentages. The UN multi-country study in 6 countries in the Asia-Pacific found that the proportions of men who'd used sexual violence against a female partner or another woman ranged anywhere from 10% right through to 60%, 6 out of 10. And so while in most contexts many men don't perpetrate sexual misconduct, that sexual misconduct is perpetrated by large minorities of men in some contexts and smaller minorities of women. And it's shaped, as I've said, by norms of masculinity, particularly norms of male sexual entitlement. Some men grow up with the message that we have the right of access to women's bodies, that women owe us sex, or we deserve sex, or that women are only sexual objects and only good for one thing. And the men who believe that are more likely than other men to then perpetrate that behaviour. There are other factors that also shape sexual misconduct, but certainly one key factor is sexist masculine norms and attitudes.
Mm-hmm. And I think another aspect or another explanation that we often use is to reduce sexual misconduct to abuse of power. But there's also a need to understand sex itself, how it's understood, how it's thought, and internalized. What is it about sex? Maybe the idea of sex is part of the problem when we talk about sexual misconduct.
There was a popular feminist slogan, a slogan that was coined by feminist advocates in the 1970s, and this slogan was, "Rape is about power, not sex." And this slogan had a valuable point. It was meant to be a counter to the misunderstanding of rape and other forms of sexual violence as driven entirely by sexual desire and as representing a kind of uncontrollable expression of sexual desire among men. You know, the myth, the false idea that men can't control our sexual desires and our sexual behaviour. And that slogan, "Rape is about power, not sex," was meant to point out that rape is an act of domination, an act of control, and so on. However, more recent feminist theorising and more recent feminist work on rape and other forms of sexual violence has recognised that, in fact, rape can be about both those things, about both power and sex. And certainly part of some men's sexual misconduct is having learnt a way of being sexual, a way of expressing attraction, a way of trying to have casual sex or start a relationship that does involve coercion, that does involve domination, that does involve entitlement. And when men ourselves learn that we can't control our desires, that women are responsible for arousing us or provoking us, and if we then sexually assault them, it's their fault, when men learn those kinds of things, we are more likely to behave in sexually coercive ways. So sexual misconduct is very much an abuse of power, but sexuality and the way that particularly men are socialised into certain forms of coercive or entitled sexuality also shape sexual misconduct. And we know that, for example, from the research among men who perpetrate sexual harassment. Again, most men don't perpetrate sexual harassment. Most men in workplaces treat the women around them with respect and care. But the men who do perpetrate sexual harassment have higher levels of hostile sexism. That is, they see women as malicious, as deceptive, as lying. They see women only as sexual objects. They see relations between men and women as competitive or adversarial, and so on. Men are also more likely to perpetrate sexual harassment in workplaces if they believe in traditional gender roles, if they lack empathy, they lack skills in sympathising with other people's experiences and views and so on. Some men also perpetrate sexual misconduct very deliberately as a way to do power. For example, perpetrating sexual misconduct against a female boss or another woman in a position of authority where those men feel threatened by that authority. So men who feel uncomfortable with women having power in workplaces or women showing skill or knowledge may try to degrade or attack that woman by using sexual misconduct in that way. So sex, gender norms and masculinity are involved in complex and varied ways in various forms of sexual misconduct.
And I think some of it is cultural conditioning. We also hear, for example, it's considered normal behavior in some cultures to sexualize women. How do we challenge that?
Look, first of all, I want to talk about the notion of sexualizing. I want to distinguish between two things. On the one hand, it is perfectly fine, in fact, it's a good thing, for people to find each other sexually desirable. For men who are attracted to women to find women desirable, for women who are attracted to men to find them desirable, men with men, women and women, and so on. That's a healthy part of sex and relationships. But there's a difference between that and, for example, only seeing women as sexual objects and not also recognising their skills, their experience, and in a professional or a work context, their formal roles, their work roles. So there's a difference between general sexual attraction on the one hand and the unfair sexual objectification of women. Likewise, there's a difference between sexual attraction on the one hand and inappropriate sexualization. Sexualizing an interaction with a woman or a particular colleague or a boss in a work context is generally inappropriate. But you talked about culture, and certainly I've encountered in many contexts some defences of sexual misconduct and of domestic and sexual violence more broadly in terms of culture. This is our tradition, or this is just the way we do things, and so on. And there are a number of responses to that. One of the responses is to say that what we think of as culture, what we think of as tradition, has in fact varied over time. There may be other practices or other roles that were part of that particular culture or that particular tradition, but have now been discarded, that are now seen as unfair or oppressive or irrelevant. Second, there is diversity and dissent or disagreement within any particular culture about what is seen as traditional and so on, and we have to open up space for that. In many cultures, there are practices that have been discarded, practices that have been put aside because they're now seen as unethical or harmful, and we can do the same with sexual misconduct. So I think that defences of are harmful or coercive sexual behaviours in terms of tradition or culture, ultimately, they're inaccurate and they're also dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Your work offers a focus on perpetrator prevention. In your experience, how effective are strategies that focus us on empowering victims compared to those aimed at stopping perpetrators?
Look, I very much think we need to do both. And in the last, 4 or 5 decades of work on sexual misconduct and domestic, family and sexual violence more broadly, there's been a very understandable focus on responding to victim survivors, the need to respond well to victim survivors. And that's often the place where workplaces and organisations start with how can we support, how can we protect the safety and well-being of the women, the men, the other people who've been subject to sexual misconduct. However, we also have to hold the perpetrators accountable. We have to respond to the perpetrators, the people who've used that sexual misconduct, and hold them accountable for their behaviour and engage them, if we can, in behaviour change. And I've been part of work in my country to bring perpetrators into the picture. We make the point that every time there's a victim, there is also a perpetrator. And often our language obscures that, it hides that. So, for example, we say Mary was subject to sexual misconduct. Now, she probably wasn't harassed or abused by a cloud or a tree. She was harassed or abused by another person. And we need to bring them into the picture so that we can do something about their behaviour. Another thing I want to say about perpetrators is that perpetrators are made, not born. Adult men or women don't come into the world wanting to cause harm to others. Instead, the willingness to perpetrate sexual misconduct, to use sexual misconduct against another person, is shaped by socialisation, shaped by the conditions of those people's lives, the way they've been taught, the way they've been raised, the messages they've received from media, from faith leaders, from policymakers, and so on. So we have to bring perpetrators into the picture. We have to name the problem of sexual misconduct as a problem of perpetration of sexual misconduct. And we have to have strategies in place to hold perpetrators accountable. So absolutely, we need to continue to centre victim survivors' voices and listen to victim survivors and make sure that our work builds their safety and well-being. And we also have to hold accountable those who are using that violence in the first place. Because ultimately our goal has to be to stop perpetration, to stop people from causing harm to others.
How do we spot a perpetrator?
Well, they don't walk around with a sign on their head saying perpetrator. And one of the things that can be most challenging for people to recognise is that the people who do use sexual misconduct in a workplace, in a conflict setting, in a development agency, may be perfectly charming people, maybe people that other people think are nice or is a good man or a leader of the community or a figurehead and so on. And perpetrators can be very skilled at hiding their perpetration and going to great lengths to get away with perpetration by isolating the victims, by blaming victims for the behaviour they have used and so on. And often there are racist and class-based stereotypes that shape community stereotypes of who is likely to perpetrate sexual misconduct, whereas in fact we know that the people who perpetrate sexual misconduct may exist across an organisation and at every level of the organisation.
Mm-hmm. And if we were to look into the aid sector and let's shift to field settings, be it in emergencies, conflict zones, or natural disasters, for people working in these contexts, we sometimes hear justifications such as, men have urges, or in isolation, it's only natural to seek out sex. Help us understand that thought process.
Yeah, isn't that a kind of terrible view of men? Isn't it a really sort of sad and negative view of men, where men are seen as kind of uncontrollable, sex-driven pigs who can't control their sexual desires and are perfectly happy to, abuse and rape someone just for sexual relief? It is a very terrible view of men, and it's a simply inaccurate one. So, for example, if men have sexual urges, they can masturbate. They can relieve themselves of that, that sexual tension or sexual pressure by themselves. Or if they can find a consenting sexual partner. So I've done some work in the mining industry in Australia and also some work in the military. And in both contexts, one key set of factors that shape whether sexual misconduct happens is the climate or the culture of the organisation. The research that we did in Australia, for example, found that in some mining sites and in some military units, there was a strong organisational tolerance for sexual misconduct. There may have been policies or laws in place that said sexual misconduct shouldn't happen, but they were widely ignored, the leadership didn't enforce them, didn't speak about them, and there was essentially a sense among people in that organisation that if you behaved in this way, you would get away with it. You would not be punished. You would not be sanctioned. So in other words, a climate of permissiveness for sexual misconduct is a key risk factor for higher levels of sexual misconduct in that setting. There are also higher levels of sexual misconduct in settings where there are far more men than women, where leadership is male-dominated, and where there's a sexist culture, a sexist or patriarchal culture. And so the climate of the organisation, its gender norms, its views of gender roles make a difference to levels of sexual misconduct in that organisation. So do the more general levels of justice in the organisation. In mining, in military, and I imagine in aid and development contexts, where antisocial and uncivil behaviour in general is tolerated, you get higher levels of sexual misconduct. Where employees don't have a voice, where there are poor mechanisms for whistleblowing, for blowing the whistle on criminal or antisocial behaviour in general, again, you get higher levels of sexual misconduct. So I've said that there are some individual risk factors to do with the individual attitudes among men and indeed women that can shape the use of sexual misconduct, but there are also organisational and cultural factors that also shape sexual misconduct.
And if we look at the online space, you've also worked on online abuse. What's uniquely particular in addressing the challenges of different forms of sexual violence or harm online?
Yeah, look, online abuse, first of all, has some distinct dynamics. So one, for example, is that female public figures, celebrities, politicians, sports players and so on, can be targeted anonymously and remotely online. And they can be targeted in mass attacks, so organised mass collective attacks against female political leaders or female journalists and public figures and so on. A second thing that's distinct about online abuse is some of the forms of abuse. So, for example, one way that women are often attacked online is through deep fake pornographic images, where their face is superimposed digitally on pornographic images to shame them, to sexualise them, to degrade them and so on. Online spaces also allow old forms of abuse to do with domestic and sexual violence, such as stalking and surveillance and so on, to now be exported online. The fact that it's more possible to abuse and harass someone without your own identity being visible. And so there's less social policing of your behaviour online as well. And people who are already predisposed to abuse, who are already likely to abuse others, online have access to a greater range of victims. They can use online information to monitor their victims, and so on.
If you could give us one piece of advice to organizations, what is one meaningful thing that they could do today to build a healthy environment where people feel safe to work in?
I think one thing is for senior leaders in organisations to regularly, visibly support the need for safe, equitable workplaces. We know that to change levels of sexual misconduct in workplaces, for example, we need a whole of institution efforts that involve policies for responding to victims and holding perpetrators accountable, education and culture change, training in unconscious bias and issues of sexual misconduct, and so on. But the keystone of that work is senior leadership support. So the one thing, it's certainly not the only thing that organisations should do, but one key thing, one meaningful thing that organisations can do is make sure that senior leaders are offering visible and consistent support. And we know from the research that that will make most difference if that support from senior leaders is regular, it's not a one-off thing, if it's visible, if they're turning up, and if it's heartfelt, if it's not tokenistic, and if it involves genuine efforts at both personal and organisational change.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. This has been really helpful for us to understand better how we can prevent sexual misconduct.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to reach out to us to prseah@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.